Benjamin Düster. He's a cultural sociologist interested in the intersection of popular music, material culture, and political ecology. He has a monograph, I think, which will be published with Bloomsbury soon, entitled Cassette Tape, the hybrid format in the digital age. And it is based on data gathered during extensive fieldwork in Australia, Japan, and the USA. And he is also an ERC fellow in musicology at Georg August University of Göttingen in Germany, and a co-founder of the International Skate Research Network, SH SHRED. This is how we say SHRED, Skateboarding, Sustainability, Health Research, and Environmental Design, for which he co-convenes the SHRED seminar series. So these are very eclectic interests. You can start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Okay, perfect. Just a disclaimer. I'm in rural Queensland right now at a motel, and I'm sitting out front in front of the reception desk because that's where the best reception is. And if you end up hearing cars racing by, that's, I guess, the rural Australia version of the Fast and the Furious that you have to endure. So my apologies in advance for that. Thanks so much for this amazing opportunity to present my work, and also for arranging this great conference. I've enjoyed it a lot, and I also look forward to checking out some of the recordings. So yeah, I will talk about tapes today, especially in Japan. And to give you a bit of a backstory, so how all of this came about. So this project, which the result is the monograph, very well. Thank you for that, Jeremy. That's been going on for about 8 years. So it's like an 8-year process, and it started at around 2014 in Berlin, while I was living in Berlin, with this tape that you can see in the center on the top, Tellbruck Continuum and Steinbeiß tape, that my friend Thomas gave me. So Thomas is there with me and Anke, our friend. This is about 10 years ago, which you can see that I have more hair on my head, and I'm about 10 years younger. And Thomas grew up as a punk in East Germany. And growing up as a punk in East Germany meant that if you wanted to listen to interesting new music that was sort of bypassing the state leadership, you would listen to cassette tapes. And you would likely, for example, if you wanted to listen to something like Black Flag, you would listen to a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of somebody who smuggled a tape across the border, for example, or had it gifted by their family in West Germany, etc. So he has this very strong cultural connection to cassette tapes. I personally am a millennial, and I grew up with cassette tapes as like kids' stories and so on. So it's a different connection there. And this is sort of like foreshadowing what my point is going to be with all of this. So we were releasing tapes, mostly specialized in like noise, ambient, experimental music and things like that. And well, what I mostly came across, and what was a bit of a head scratcher, was that there was this thing called Cassette Store Day, which was celebrating, and I think it was 2016. It was like celebrating fairly internationally this like sort of, yeah, regained interest in cassette tapes. And it was also taking place in Germany, and we participated. It was like a Cassette Store Day event in Berlin, and we participated in there. And it was all rather confusing because in our scene, where we had friends and where we played shows and where we organized events and shows and stuff, this idea that the cassette was dead and then it sort of it resurfaced, or like it was brought back from the dead, or some kind of that along those lines, that kind of idea. It didn't make any sense because there were so many projects and so many labels that throughout the 2000s and the 2010s were releasing cassettes the whole time. So I came across more and more these like rather, in a way, cheesy headlines of like cassettes being compared to vinyl records, who also seen regained interest. And yeah, you see this like dead media stomps the terror again and these kind of comparisons. So I collected some of those and it ended up being a first foray into what later would become this study where I was comparing what was happening as sort of like an inside perspective in the scene in Germany and compared that to what was happening in Japan because I felt it was always interesting that in 1980s and 1990s cassette culture, there was this very strong connection between sort of proto-internet connection through cassette tapes mediated between countries that were very far away from each other, like Germany and Japan, for example. So looking a bit more, like digging a bit further, what I found was that a lot of these sort of like showy headlines were basing their claims of like a cassette revival on increased sales numbers. But interestingly, a lot of them were sort of brushing aside or not even like acknowledging the DIY music scenes that I was a part of. So usually you would have these sort of like stages where cassette sales were like reaching a certain point or they were like tripling and then it would show up in some sales statistics collected by, for example, this American company Nielsen, which then show up in an outlet like a magazine like Billboard and so on, and then they get celebrated. And this was very prominent in the 2010s. And like one of the most recent examples that I found for this was is this one that you can see on the top right here, which is from last year. And it's interesting because it says cassette sales reached its high level since 2003. This is from 2023. And the big example here is this awesome Mix Volume 1, which is, of course, the soundtrack for the Guardians of the Galaxy movie franchise. But this movie in and of itself is already, I don't know when it came out actually, but it's been a couple of years already. So you can see how old this idea actually is of a cassette revival. So some of the stuff that I found where the most I guess, absurd example I found is an article from 2007, which literally proclaims the death of the cassette tape. And in the same year, 2007, an article, I think, in the Los Angeles Times that was talking about DIY music scenes using cassettes still. So you can see there's these two parameters at work here. And because it was also confusing, I gained more and more interest in it. And I guess also because I found things like here and at Big Love Records in Harajuku, again, just re-emphasizing this idea that actually it depends on who you ask. You know, if you ask certain people who are very invested in independent music culture, they will likely tell you that some medium like the cassette tape probably never has been gone from their from their perspective. So yeah, just another opportunity for my shameless self-plug here. So the study is that I'm presenting on is based on fieldwork that I conducted in 2018, 2019. So that was over 30 interviews I did with artists, labor operators, shop managers, collectors. And I did that combined with participant observation in Kanto, Kansai, and Kyushu. And yeah, the monograph, I'm very happy to announce it's going to be released with Bloomsbury next year. So what am I doing in this book? I'm arguing that there is sort of the cassette has a hybrid entity or has a hybrid significance in current music cultures. And this is especially important because it is essential here to take not only like these economic aspects into consideration, but also the material aspect of the fact that the cassette is one of the few, if not the only format right now, which you like physical format that you can re-record onto like multiple times, for example. And because of this, it has seen a very wide range of uses across different cultural contexts, but also technological contexts. So this book is basically a documentation of me being fed up with this idea of a cassette revival and like trying to challenge it from like attacking it from different perspectives, I guess. And I also do this with keeping in mind that there is definitely a material precarity among cassette consumption, production, and distribution in the new media age, because uh, the availability of cassette players is just very limited. And yeah, getting old players repaired also questionable, especially as parts are not necessarily readily available like they are, for example, with vinyl record players like turntables, because the DJ cultures were upholding a demand for sturdy materiality. Let me have a look at my notes. So, boop, boop, boop. So yeah, what I found is that despite the influx of streaming music technologies, and because there is like this desire for convenience and mobility, cassettes have grown. And at the same time, I guess the main theme for the book is the question why these analog technologies display such a resilience. And to some extent also, I guess, me grappling with the question, does this actually mean that technology is not as linear as it always has appeared, or as always it was told and I guess reiterated? So yeah, hybridity is at the core here, and we can see that, for example, in appropriations like through Koshiro Hino in his project YPY. Hino-san is an artist in Osaka who is not only active in a very interesting band called Goat, but also DJs cassette tapes and in his with his YPY project, and he ran a tape label called Bird Friend. So yeah, when we view this in the relation to the overbearing number of options on streaming platforms, I argue that the material interaction, so this is a reference to Tim Dant, with cassettes, it's a physically limiting choice, and it also limits the potential for decision fatigue, while at the same time providing a material basis for something like the performance of musical tastes in the sense of Ennio, and support of the scene. So like a materialized artifact to express the support for the scene, whether you're at a show or whether you want to collect something. So this present interest in cassettes among DIY music practitioners is therefore stemming from an intentional complication of music access through this material interaction. And these necessary interventions like reeling and flipping around cassette tapes, which for the mature generations who in the 80s and 90s were relying on this technology to work. And therefore, it's in some cases, when the favorite tape got chewed up by the tape deck, it's very, yeah, it can be traumatic even if it's like a one-of-a-kind tape. So nowadays, maybe we can compare this to like a classic car that is not the daily driver, for example. Now these are like choices. So it's an optional physical ritual that younger generations enjoy to engage in. And it's offsetting this like governance of information technology over everyday life, as for example, David Hasman-Horsch and Leslie Meyer have put it. So in other words, the cassette's user experience is facilitating an active, like mindful offline material interaction. And that means it's a music experience that is not part of this online multitasking that we have to do every day, but it's reinterpreting music as an opportunity to have a break from that online multitasking. So trading tapes, for example, fosters social resilience inside the scene, because they have to or they are in some instances traded on like this like face-to-face basis. So Dave Novak has written about in the context of Japanoise that if you want to get noise, you have to make noise, or you had to make noise. That's like in this cassette chapter that he wrote. So an example that I name here is Yabuki Dokon Kobo, which used to be, let me see, yeah, used to be a production plant for cassette tapes in Kogane in near Tokyo. And the interesting dynamic here is that they used to produce for the anchor industry mainly, but starting in the 1980s, they would also let DIY punk bands, for example, produce in their facilities. So one of my informants told me that from then on, basically the bands would go in there and like put their stickers on the walls. So like by the time they unfortunately had to close in 2018, the stickers were like, you know, plastered along the walls. So this like, I guess, very these like opposing cultural entities of like anchor and like hardcore punk were combined within this facility, and it was literally inscribed on the walls. So what I just briefly jumped over here is just something that I wanted to point out as well. So these are sales statistics. So this is like the domestic total of cassette production. And here in the highlighted area, you have on the left, you have like the singles, and then you have like others. And I just want you to look at the bottom here where I put the orange box. So this is 2003. Just like keeping in mind this connection between 2003 with the Guardians of the Galaxy tape. So this is national cassette production within Japan. By 2013, this was cut in half. And then last year, when in other Western countries, they were claiming it was the highest since 2003. In Japan, it was actually way down. We went down to three titles released on cassette, and again in the anchor genre there. So the question then is, what is happening in Japan with that? Because there's examples like Yabuki Roko and Kobo, where unfortunately one of the operators passed away. So there's this trajectory where more and more manufacturers are closing. And Kosaka Takashi is a member of the Tokyo hardcore punk scene who said that he used that facility to produce his tapes. But then he went on to go to another order from another company called Aimoto Kagaku, which specializes in ordering their cassettes from overseas. So there's production plants in the United States, North America, Canada, the UK. There used to be one in Taiwan, Mobi Neko. So Japanese DIY projects like labels and bands have turned international, sort of to feed the supplies, cassette tapes. So it's an interesting dynamic. And this dynamic is also emphasized through something like Cassette Store Day Japan, because Endo Takamasa, who is operating that event, is also operating an importing company, or a company that imports vinyl records and cassette tapes from duplication.ca from Canada. So he's pointing out here that especially young generations are really interested in how these formats look, because many of them do actually not own like the hardware anymore to play it back. They want to have it as sort of like a collectible item. And that is also connected to the fact that often they come with download codes that give you access to like the MP3 file, or you can stream it on a website like Bandcamp, for example. So we can see here, because he's very interested, Anderson is very interested in sort of making cassettes attractive to younger generations. He got Scandal, band from Osaka, on board to be sort of an ambassador for cassette tapes, which resulted in a fairly interesting interview at HMV in Shibuya that I attended in 2018. And he also, actually, Scandal didn't publish or release any of their albums on cassette tape, but they released this very strange sort of Walkman type player, which is actually one of these USB converter players that you can find for, I don't know, maybe like 10 euro, $10 on a website like AliExpress, but it's like rebranded with like the logo on there. And yeah, it was there was a big uprise for that as well. And I actually researched a bit in like the fan forum and the Scandal fan forum, and the fan community was really not impressed by this move. And so there's, again, there's sort of like this disparity between the mainstream trying to like grab the tapes and like grab, I guess, like the cultural capital of like the DIY music scenes that are using tapes. And Tatewaki Yusuke is somebody who is an avid collector, and he was running sort of like a collectors talk event called the Buy Nows Club, with his friend Toda Takeshi, who's also a very avid collector. And he was talking about like how there's sort of this influx of electronic music and experimental electronic music released on tapes with like American artists, and how this sort of also gained attraction within like the Japanese scene. But he's saying that the cassette is just an object now. It has become something like a souvenir, memento for keeping a memory. It's a thing only for people that really want it. The fans, so to say, it has become a standard. Even J-pop artists and so on release cassettes. I think it's not a rare item anymore. So the novelty has worn off within like the scene and like the new generations that grew into the DIY music scene. Whereas something like Cassette Store Day is trying to, I guess, really push that like novelty aspect of it. Toda Takeshi is saying basically similar things, but he's also emphasizing that this like visual aspect, so of this visual turn, I call that a visual turn of the tape, has really sort of restructured how cassettes are consumed. Where you have, for example, labels like Orange Milk, where like the visual branding is extremely important, and it sort of has a connection also to this sort of like 80s aesthetic of city pop and so on. So he's saying each tape feels like a piece of art, and yeah, some of them are really they overemphasize the packaging as well in that regard. He might be an example of that. Hiratsuru Tomohito was running well, it's his name, as his stage name, as his ambient project, Dün, but also a label, where he was actually also using anchor cassettes, which mainly came in or come in white and black shells. So not as attractive from this like Cassette Store Day visual branding sort of perspective. But he said that he's a minimalist, so he didn't care. And you can see he put stickers or labels on it anyway. So yeah, but he is one of those people from like a generation that says they've been there all the time, basically. Okay, thank you, Chiharu. I'm about to wrap up anyway. So yeah, basically, there's this challenge of the idea of a cassette culture, not a cassette culture, cassette revival. And at the same time, for younger generations, tapes can appear as sort of these novelty items, but the production distribution has certainly seen like an increase. But I would argue that cassettes are not revived per se, but are just more common to see nowadays than like maybe CDRs, and or during the period where CDRs and CDs really dominated, especially the Japanese popular music landscape. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.